Question for you today. Is it okay with you that God is in charge? I want you to think about that. Is it okay with you that God is in charge? To me personally, there is nothing that helps me sleep at night better knowing that God is in charge. I find the concept of God's sovereign rule and care and right to be incredibly comforting. When I agree with his sovereign care. Equally, I find nothing more disturbing and more frustrating than God's sovereign right to rule. Here's question number 2. Is it okay with you when God works contrary to what you think is best? So the first question is it okay with you that God's in charge? I think most Christians would say, oh, absolutely, sovereignty of God. It's a great thing knowing God's in charge. Okay, but is it okay with you when God works contrary to what you think is best? I think it's a little similar of a question, but it really comes down to the things that you experience in your life. Scripture says that it's in a man's way, it's a man's way to plan his steps. There is a way that seems right to a person. It seems right to me that good things would happen. It seems right to me that people who get pregnant always deliver healthy, strong babies. It seems best to me that when you share the gospel with somebody, they see the beauty of the gospel, the glory of Jesus Christ, and they get saved. It seems best to me a lot of things that, quite frankly, don't ever really end up happening. So on the one part, my question today is it okay with you that God's in charge? I think most of us would quickly say yes. The second question asks that question in regards to your own personal life. Is it okay with you when God works contrary to what you think is best? I want you to take your Bibles this morning and turn to Joshua chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 13 through 15. And in this question, or in this passage, we're going to see how Joshua answers that question. Now, the reason why I ask these questions today is not just because, I was thinking about them this week, but I'm thinking about what's coming up on Tuesday, the presidential election. Whether we're talking about COVID and furloughs and quarantines and mask orders, that's one part. Are you okay when life turns out different than the way you want or that you think's best? So the other part of that is, on Tuesday or Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, whenever we find out the results of the election, what are you going to do if the guy that you or gal who you were hoping to win doesn't win? The person that you agree with ideologically, the person that you're kind of pinning the hopes of America on, what happens if you find out the election results Wednesday morning and the name of your guy and the mascot of your party isn't up there as the winner? Now the question is it okay that God's in charge? Absolutely. But what happens, are you going to be okay when God works, or if God works in a way that seems contrary to what you think best politically? Does God have the right? Of course he does. Are you going to be okay with it? And that really is another question. Let's look at how Joshua responds to a situation that he was not expecting. And I hope that it gives us direction, not necessarily on how to vote, but on how to perceive the election and how to deal with its aftermath. Let's look. Joshua 5, verses 13 through 15. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No." Now let me give you some background on what's happening here. You might remember the story of the children of Israel being slaves in Egypt. You might be familiar with Moses, who goes into Egypt as God's deliverer, and he says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." We see the 10 plagues of Egypt. Finally, we see Pharaoh letting the Israelites leave. They leave. They walk through the Red Sea. We see the armies of Egypt destroyed in that same account. We see the children of Israel go to Mount Sinai. They get the law, the 10 Commandments. We also see the golden calf. They end up traveling to the promised land. This is where God wants his people to live and be a testimony of his grace and his goodness. Their job is to be obedient to God and to be faithful to God and go in and take military and political and spiritual possession of the land based upon the promises that God had made to them in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Well, this exodusing generation goes to the promised land. They send in the 12 spies. They come back. 12 spies come back. 2 of the spies, Joshua, who this book is named after, and Caleb, they say, "Yeah, we can go in. God's going to be faithful. He's going to help us have victory. We're going to overcome. There's nothing he can't do." But the other 10 spies, they say, "God can't do it. God can't do it. We're going to die. There's no hope." And all of Israel, who is pinning their hopes on going into the promised land, they get scared and they become disobedient. As a result, they're going to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. So like the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy deal with this 40-year wilderness wandering. That unfaithful exodusing generation that was supposed to go into the promised land, as a judgment for their disobedience, they die out in the wilderness. Everybody 20 years and younger at the moment of that disobedience, and everybody that's been born in those 40 years now are standing on the doorsteps of the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. And now they have a second chance to go in and obey God and be faithful to his command. So what we come to in the book of Joshua is the person who's going to lead them into the promised land is not Moses. Moses dies, and his predecessor is Joshua, a godly man. Joshua, and we see it in chapter 1, Joshua is commissioned by God to become Israel's new leader. What kind of leader is he? Well, he's a spiritual leader. And we see that in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 9, where we see Joshua leads them in the spiritual ritual of circumcision for men. Based upon the command of God to Abraham, every descendant of Abraham, to remember the promise that God made to them in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the Abrahamic covenant, is to be circumcised in the flesh, meaning, I'm not going to go into detail, but the male sex organ has a protective sheath that is to be cut off, and to remove that, and as a sign of allegiance to God. So when God makes a promise to Noah, he gives a sign, and the sign is the rainbow. In the new covenant for you and me, the sign of our covenant is baptism. It is an act of obedience, and it is a declaration of allegiance and commitment to God. Well, circumcision is the same, a little bit more painful, but no less important. So they're not just going to go into the promised land and have military victory. They're supposed to be spiritual agents of God who are doing this out of allegiance to God and his plan to redeem the world. So Joshua is a spiritual leader. He's also a military leader. We see that in verse 13, but we also see that in Joshua chapter 2, where Joshua is coming up with a strategic plan to overthrow the first city in the promised land, the city of Jericho. So Joshua's a spiritual leader. He is a military leader, but you know what? He also heads up the civil government of Israel. So he's also the president. So he's a tribal chief. He's judge, jury, and executioner of sorts. And he's the spiritual leader. I mean, Joshua has a tremendous amount of responsibility. Now, when we come to Joshua chapter 5, verse 13, it says, when Joshua was by Jericho. And I want to make sure you understand this. When this warrior shows up, this man who has a sword drawn standing between Joshua and Jericho, this man shows up and Joshua is doing everything that he's supposed to be doing. Okay? It's not like David, who's back at the palace sleeping with Bathsheba while his men are out dying. Joshua's on the front lines. He's scouting out his military strategy. He's making a strategy. He's checking out fortifications. He's checking on enemy movements. He's checking on the resources of his guys. He's checking on the horses being watered and all of the, taking inventory of the weaponry. My point is, Joshua is being faithful when this man shows up. And that's going to be important because when this man shows up, Joshua turns and sees him. And he sees that he has a sword drawn. Joshua asks a very reasonable question. Are you for us or for our adversaries? Basically, Joshua looks up. This man is standing with a sword drawn. Not always a sign of peace, but he's standing between Joshua and his objective, which is Jericho. So the question is, has this guy come from Jericho to attack us? Or is this guy coming from Jericho or somewhere else to join us and help us overcome God's objective? The man answers in a very odd way. Are you for us or against us? And the warrior says, no. Now, that's not really the question that I asked. If you're Joshua, that's not the question that I asked. The answer is either I'm for you or I'm for them. But the question that the way that the warrior answers is seemingly inappropriate to the question that Joshua gives. Until we learn the identity of the warrior. Let's keep reading. So Joshua says, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. And now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Okay. Joshua quickly learns that this is no man. He thinks it's a man, but he quickly finds out it's not. The first indication that it's not is he's the commander of the Lord's army. Now, this designation, this term, is often used in reference to angelic beings. A lot of times like when the birth of Christ and the shepherds are in the field, the angels arrive and it says that they are the heavenly host. Well, the word host there is really army. It's military movement, campaign, that kind of idea. So he identifies himself as the commander of the army of the Lord. He's the commander of the heavenly host. But we soon find out that this cannot be just an angel. Because what he says is, what we see is that Joshua immediately falls on his face. Now, this is not uncommon when a human being comes into contact with an angelic being. In Revelation 22, 8 through 9, John says this, I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw, and who did he hear it from? Well, who's with him? He's an angel. He says, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed me these things. But he, the angel, said to me, John, do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and of your brethren, the prophets, and those who heed the words of this book. Worship God. An angel from heaven will not allow themselves to be worshiped no matter how majestic they are. Why? Because they know that there is only one being in the universe that is deserving of worship. Now, fallen angels like Satan, you know what they're after? They're after what Joshua is doing, and they're after what John is doing. They wouldn't stop it, but good angels do stop it. And you know why? Because they know it's risky. Because they know they don't have a right to be worshipped, and they know it's risky for the person. It is not good for John. It is not good for Joshua to be worshiping another created being. So what does he say here? He fell down on his face and he worshiped. Oddly enough, though, this commander never corrects Joshua. Why? Because this is no man. This is no created being. This is no angel. Who is it? And Joshua identifies him. What does my Lord say to his servant? Joshua quickly realizes that this is a member of the Godhead. He goes on to say, and the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And really, this is quite a quote to Joshua. The words that God said to Joshua in this case is the same words that God says at the burning bush to Moses. Take off your shoes, for the place in which you stand is holy ground. You can imagine that as Moses' protege, Moses would have repeated the story over and over and over about his commissioning. And so when Joshua hears this, he's not just hearing a new word, he's hearing connected to these stories of Moses, these memories of Moses where he says, God spoke to me in a burning bush. And now God is speaking to him in the form of a man. Now when God takes on the form of a man, it's not just any member of the Trinity. It is the second member. Well, who is that? It's God's Son. It's God the Son. Now, we know this theologically. We refer to these as Christophanies. These are Old Testament manifestations of the second member of the Trinity. In other words, the second member of the Trinity is going to manifest himself in human form again. And you know what his name's going to be? It's going to be Jesus. So this is Jesus before he's named Jesus. This is amazing. So here it is. Joshua's preparing all these battles. He's being obedient. He's being faithful. He's being a faithful president. He's being a faithful general. He's being a faithful pastor. And he turns around in the midst of all these preparations, in the midst of doing all the things he should be doing. He turns around and he sees Jesus before he's Jesus. And he says to Jesus, now imagine this. Whose side are you on? Now, that's not an unreasonable question. Joshua doesn't yet know the identity. But what does Jesus, before he's Jesus, say? No. Joshua doesn't ask an unreasonable question. He just asks the wrong question. Whose side is Jesus on? The question is, this political season, is Jesus on the side of the Democrat? Or is Jesus on the side of the Republican? And the answer is no. Jesus is on his own side. The real question for Joshua is, whose side is he on? The real question this political season is not, is Jesus for Trump or Biden? The real question is God's people, are God's people, on the side of Christ? Because he's the one that really matters. Because he's the one who's in charge. So my initial question, my first questions were, is it okay with you that God's in charge? Is it okay that Jesus is calling the shots this election season? But maybe even closer to home, is it okay that Jesus is calling the shots with COVID? Is it okay that Jesus is calling the shots with where you were born? Is it okay that Jesus is calling the shots in your home? Is it okay that Jesus is in charge? We say, well, of course, we want Jesus to be in charge. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. But is it okay with you when Jesus works contrary to what you think is best? I would never say this to Jesus, but sometimes I wonder if Jesus is on my side. But the reality is I'm asking the wrong question. It's not about whether or not Jesus is on my side. The question is whether or not I'm on Jesus's. What an important question that Joshua faces. And so it's not a third question, but it's kind of a follow-up question. Is it okay with you that you are outranked by Jesus. And really, the Jesus before he's Jesus, that's what he does with Joshua. Joshua's the president, he's the pastor, and he's the general. And notice what the second member of the Trinity says. He goes, but I'm the commander of the Lord's army. Okay, Joshua, you might be the general, all right? But I'm God. And really what this pre-incarnate Jesus does here is he pulls rank. He pulls rank. Is it okay with you? I'll ask some more questions here. Is it okay with you when Jesus reveals his will through varying life events? To reveal his will, God often reveals his will. He reveals his will in the scripture, but he often reveals his will for what his plan is and what he's planning and what his people were to do as we experience life events. Joshua is planning to either put a siege on Jericho or to draw the army of Jericho out and meet them in open battle. That's not what he's doing. Notice up in chapter 6, verse 20, it says, now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel, and none went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war. So he concocts this incredible plan that doesn't seem reasonable at all. Israel's not going to shoot arrows. They're not going to shoot off cannons. They're not going to draw them out into the open. Every day they're going to march around the city in absolute quietness. On the seventh day, they're going to march around it in quietness 7 times, blow the trumpets, and God's going to knock the walls down. Sometimes the things that God's doing in real life are really befuddling. They don't make a lot of sense. You know, we were humming along at Calvary really well. We were having really great momentum in ministry. And then COVID happens and we don't meet for 8 weeks. Okay. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm going to be honest, I struggled being okay with that. But God was doing something. How do I know he was doing something? Because it was happening. Okay. And sometimes God even allows really hard, difficult things to happen because he has a greater plan that he's moving along. The question for Joshua is, will he accept that God outranks him? And it's the same for you and me. Is it okay with you? Is it okay with you that you have some health struggles? Is it okay with you that the other guy wins the election? Is it okay with you that you lose your job? Is it okay with you that you're not fulfilled in your job? Is it okay with you? Is it okay with you? And I'm not saying that all of those things aren't sad and aren't confusing. I'm just saying, is it okay with you if God does something different than what you think is best? Notice here in verse 14, he says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Why didn't you come earlier? If I'm Joshua, why'd you allow me to put all this work into it if you were just going to change the plan? Can I get a witness? Why do we spend all this time strategic planning if you're going to shut it down for 8 weeks and then we don't know what we're doing for the rest of the summer or winter and who knows how long this is going to carry on? Why didn't you let me know? Why has America been allowed to get to the place that she is? Why has God permitted it? Is it okay, though? Is it okay that God outranks us and that we know he has a plan, but he outranks us, that no matter what we think's best, he has an opportunity and he has the right to do something different than what we think he ought to do? I just want to say, we may not be sure about what God is doing, but we can be guaranteed that God is up to something. Why? Because God is an active God who is working out his redemptive plan for the ages. And COVID and elections and your health issues and our loss of babies, okay, doesn't take God off track, and there's something about those things that had to happen for his plan to be fulfilled. I don't understand it, but am I okay with it? Is it okay that you're outranked when he reveals his will through life events? Second question, or maybe the fifth question, or how many questions I've asked, is it okay that you're outranked when he comes to conquer not only our enemy, but us? Now, here's what's interesting about verses 13 through 15. Before God delivers Jericho into the hands of the Israelites, okay, he is delivering Joshua's heart into his own possession. Now, Joshua's doing everything that he should be doing, but it seems like, although Joshua's not sinning, there is possibly a perspective that Joshua's carrying that needs to be corrected. Namely, he might hold the title of president, general, and pastor, but he isn't God. And there has to be a heart change within Joshua before advancement can be made in that plan. It seems like here that the second member of the Trinity, before he comes to conquer the enemy at Jericho, he comes to conquer the hearts of his own people. And the question is, will his people willingly invite him in and submit to his plan and will? Most of all, God has to conquer Israel's allegiance. That's the promise, or that's the problem with the first attempt to enter the land. They physically go to the land, but when they smash up against a difficult season, they say, it's too hot, it's too hard, it's too difficult, God's not big enough, we can't do it. And the people rebel against God, meaning they will not accept that God knows best, no matter what he said. They don't trust him. So is it okay that you're outranked, understanding that he has come to conquer your heart first? I think this season of COVID really is not about judgment on America. I think this season of COVID is to reveal the hearts of the people of God. I think this election is going to say way more about where you are in your relationship with Jesus than it is going to be an indictment on the spiritual vitality of our nation. Why? Because for some Christians, Donald Trump is Jesus Christ. He is a living, breathing hope of America. And I just want to say today that Trump is not Jesus, and neither is Joe Biden. There is only one Jesus. There is only one commander of the Lord, and it isn't Joshua, and it isn't Jericho, and it isn't you, and it isn't me, and it isn't a political platform, and it certainly isn't a political candidate. There is only one commander of the heavenly hosts, and he has come to conquer hearts and allegiances of his people. Joshua's total submission to Jesus, the fact that he falls to his face and he worships, he bends his will to the will of the commander of the heavenly host, demonstrates that God has Joshua's heart. And God has to have Joshua's heart before he can get the glory in the defeat of Jericho. It's really amazing. But oftentimes we fight what God is doing. We complain, we argue, we get off mission. We watch endless hours of news while people are going to hell. We drop bitter truth bombs on social media because we're angry. And you know what it demonstrates? It demonstrates that Jesus really has not conquered our heart. Because if we did, we would live different and we would live for a different purpose. Is it okay that Jesus outranks you when he reveals his will through life events that don't make sense to us? When he comes to conquer your heart more than the heart of the enemy? And is it okay with you that you're outranked when he allows hardship to bring salvation? Israel is going to go into Jericho, and most of the people of Jericho are going to perish because they reject the rule of God in their land. But you know what? Out of the ashes of Jericho comes an amazing story of a prostitute by the name of Rahab. She hears about Israel's God. And instead of rejecting him, you know what she does? She also accepts that he's a conqueror. And she believes in him, and she trusts him. And as a result, she and her family are saved. And years later, and you can read this in the genealogies of Jesus, do you know that one of the great ancestors of Jesus is a harlot from the city of Jericho named Rahab? Is it okay that God allows COVID to bring people into the kingdom? Are you willing to suffer the negative impact in some ways on your finances and on your mental health to endure COVID so that some would be softened up to hear the gospel and come to faith in Jesus Christ? Is it okay that your political candidate loses? In order that God's going to use that circumstance to continue the work of his redemptive plan and bringing people into his kingdom through salvation. And listen, if you don't think God uses politics, and you don't think God uses COVID, and you don't think God uses losing jobs to soften up people's hearts to the gospel, then you're not reading the book of Acts. And you're not reading the Old Testament. And you've forgotten the things that God used in your life to soften you up to the gospel. And it wasn't always gumdrops and lollipops. It was difficult life events over a series of time. So, I go back to my questions. Is it okay? Is it okay with you that God's in charge? Oh yeah, sovereignty of God. Love singing about the sovereignty of God. Okay, well, is it okay with you when God works contrary to what you think is best? Is it? Now here's what's neat. If you skip over from Joshua chapter 5 and you skip almost completely to the end of the book of Joshua, you come to Joshua 24 verses 14 and 15. Joshua now is getting ready to die. He's led them into the land. They take possession. He's getting ready to die. And this is his final question. This is his question to the children of Israel, the next generation. He says this, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river of Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Notice what Joshua doesn't say here. Joshua doesn't say, God was on my side, because he learned his lesson in Joshua chapter 5. That early in his life when he asked, "Are you on my side?" God said, "No." The question is, are you on my side? I hope this election season you realize that there's way more on the line, okay, than your guy winning. And if your guy doesn't win on Tuesday or whenever we get the word, I want you to accept it as a part of what God is allowing to happen for his redemptive plan to unfold and to get your attention and mine and many others to live on mission for the glory of Jesus Christ. There's way more going on here than just an election. It's God unfolding his redemptive plan. And is it okay that God's in charge? And is it okay if God does something different than what you think is best? And the real question here is, do you expect God to be on your side? Or have you asked the question, am I on God's side? Blessings to you, my friends. Consider these things, for they are the great questions of life.